Today we're going to talk about the land of Israel and also the state of Israel. As you may or may not know, November 29th is a milestone date in the state of Israel's development and founding. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we're going to start really from the Bible's times. And we're talking about a little bit the history of Israel and what happened and what transpired very quickly. Just kind of like an oversight, an overview of this very important central part of Jewish life and living. But I think one question I want to present on the outset, which I think really, looms large in any discussion that we have about the state of Israel, any religious, any historical, any political discussions, is what's all the fuss about? You go to Israel and you see a land and you see, stop signs and traffic lights and police officers and there's taxes and, there's mountains and valleys and different seasons. What's the big deal? This is a country like any other, you would seem. That's what it looks like. Yet it's been the center of Jewish focus for millennia. Multiple, like 3 millennia at least. It's been the yearning of the Jews. Go back to Jerusalem, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, reestablish the state of Israel. All that has been so central to the yearning in exile for thousands of years. And the question is why? What's it all about? What's all the fuss about? And incidentally, as we all know, we'll get to this a little bit later as well, secular Zionism, we'll talk about secular Zionism versus religious Zionism, but secular Zionism kind of didn't understand the fuss either. Herzl threatened to quit the Zionist movement if they didn't adopt the British offer of taking Uganda as a place for the Jewish state. So, and there was this tremendous tension because the religious Zionism, to them, it was only about Israel. And the secular Zionism, it doesn't make any sense. Rationally, you want a state. Let's get a state wherever they give us. It could be in Africa. It could be in Asia. It could be
Buffalo, New York.
Grand Island in Buffalo, New York. That's right. In 1825, there was a movement to establish a Jewish state in a tiny little sliver of land that separates near Niagara Falls in Buffalo, New York, which is. I wonder how that would have worked out. It's even smaller than the state of Israel, if you could imagine anything smaller than that. So I want to start off by talking a little bit of the Jewish perspective, the Jewish traditional perspective of establishment of a Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. What's it all about? So let's start with the Talmud. Talmud says here that the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel is equal to all the rest of the mitzvahs combined. So if you take the mitzvah of Shabbat and Passover and giving a child circumcision, study Torah, and you make a pile of all the mitzvahs, 612 of them.
Even visiting the sick.
Visiting the sick, everything. And then you put on the other side the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, they're equal.
Wow.
Which is surprising. And it's doubly surprising when you find out that there are several mitzvahs that they say the same thing about. For example, the mitzvah of studying Torah. You put that on the scale and put the other 12 on the other side of the scale. They're even.
Yeah, what about observing the Sabbath? Is
that would be a third. There's seven such mitzvahs. Okay. And my grandfather of blessed memory wrote, one of his last books that he wrote was 2 approaches to understanding these 7 mitzvahs. What's special about these 7 mitzvahs that the Talmud labels them in separate places, disparate places, labels them that these mitzvahs are equal to all the mitzvahs combined. So one of the themes that emerges from that discussion, or from that book, is the idea of holiness. And when I say the word holiness, everyone gets a little uneasy because the word holiness, or as we say in Hebrew, kedusha, it doesn't really have a good definition. Well, how would we define holiness?
Separate.
Oh, there you go. So that's a good definition. But if you ask the typical guy in the street, what does holiness mean?
It's probably the paramount level of goodness.
I would say peace.
Godlike.
Okay, so we have different definitions of, and now holiness is a central word in Jewish, for sure, spirituality, but even religion. And we find that the land of Israel is the holiest of land. Well, what does that mean? You go there and you inspect the soil, and it's the same soil. You go there and it's a good question. What does it mean to be holy? So I think, I don't want to talk about holiness for that long, but I think the core idea is that holiness is not something that can be measured in material and physical properties. You can't measure it. You can't find it on the microscope. It's like a soul. The soul is really holy. Well, how do we measure the holiness of a soul? How do we measure the soul to begin with? It's not something physical and tangible. So whatever it is about the land of Israel, yes, it's wonderful and it has all the different seasons and it has mountains and you have snow-capped mountains and you have the desert. You have everything there in this tiny little sliver of land. But whatever is holy and special about the land is not something that is easily perceived. It's something where you look at the land and it has multiple layers. There's the physical layer, which is wonderful, and then there's a spiritual layer, the holy layer, which you really kind of have to work hard to observe. I'll give you guys an example of what I'm trying to say here. We find a great episode in the Talmud of one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Zera, and he emigrates from Babylon to Israel. As we'll see a little bit later, the Jewish people for many, many hundreds of years had concurrent communities, one in Israel, one in Babylon. And there was a very frequent transfer of people, of ideas as well, from one to the other. So this great rabbi comes and he comes to Israel, and he starts praying. What does he pray? He prays to forget all of his Torah. Now, why would you do that? You're a great scholar, you know a lot of Torah. Does it make sense that you should, I don't know, now you're in Israel. Like, this is a wonderful place. This is a nice confluence of Torah and Israel. It's wonderful. Why would you forget to pray? So Thomas says he prayed to forget it, sorry. He prayed to forget it because the Torah of Israel is on such a higher quality, he doesn't want to have to be bogged down with the Torah of the diaspora. Which, to us, it doesn't make any sense. It's like we're talking about things that are so intangible. But on the spiritual level, there's something incredibly different about the land. And I encourage anyone here, next time you go to Israel, if you haven't been, I encourage you to be there. I was there 2 weeks ago, so I'm kind of a little fresh. You go to Israel, and the big question you have to ask is, can I feel it? Can I sense it? Is it something different? Do I go to the Western Wall? I go to I look at Temple Mount. Does it mean anything to me? And if it does, if you feel something, then you know that you have a connection with your spiritual self as well. Because your soul feels it for sure. The question is, do you feel your soul or not? For the soul, it's like Disneyland for a child, for a baby, for the baby's body. Right? It's delighted. It's in a place where it's everything's wonderful. The soul feels at home suddenly. Less resistance to its environment. If you feel something special, then you know that you can feel a little bit into what your soul's going through. If you don't, then you know that you have to try to access that. You know, how do you access feeling what your soul is going through? You know, that's a good question. But if you could do that, you would feel different in the land of Israel. They could take someone who has a spiritual sensitivity. They could blindfold him and drop him anywhere in the world, and about to tell you, is Israel not, because they can feel it.
It's like it's a vortex, like Sedona.
Well, no, it's spiritual. It's not kind of like anything that's
But
not.
you can feel it.
That's right. So it's like the force. Ooh, it's like the force.
That's what I just said.
May the force
Is it the
be
force?
with you.
Is that the force? I don't know. Is that what the force is? Is that what the force is? I'm a Star Wars
Vortex. Some people,
novice.
when they
I
do it,
apologize.
they feel
That's a
it.
good analogy. I mean,
Never watched the
from a
movies.
spiritual
It's palatable for those
I'll give you guys another
who are
example.
sensitive enough
And
to
some
feel
people
it.
feel like they've been there before.
That's very interesting. That's right. I'll give you guys another example here. We talk about Shabbat, right? Shabbos Kodesh, we say. We call Shabbos the Holy Shabbos. And, you know, it's a day. There's Sunday, Monday, there's Saturday, right? What's the difference? So my grandfather told the story that when he got to Yeshiva in the Mir in 1934, you know, there was the leaders of the yeshiva, the heads of yeshiva would sit in the front, and all the students would sit like, you know, that's the way it still is today, right? The rabbi's in the front, correct? And he got there on a Tuesday. And then on Friday night, he asked one of his friends. He asks him, "Well, who's that new rabbi in the front? There's a new guy there. Doesn't make any. Is there a guy who comes only for Shabbos?" He said, "No. That's the same rabbi as the rest of the week. But the whole week his face is ashen, and on Shabbos his face is flushed." He says, literally, I trust my grandfather. He says this. Literally, the man looks entirely different the week and on Shabbos. They look different. He looks different.
Kind of analogous to Moses when he went to the burning bush and came back. His face. That's what kind of reminded me of what you just said. Yeah. Is there a similar?
And that's the idea of
phenomenon
holiness.
there?
It's for some people they feel it and it's different. And for some people they don't feel it. There's a discussion in the Talmud as to what happens if someone is shipwrecked or whatever. They lose track of time. When is Shabbos? You're on an island by yourself and you lost track of time. You're delirious and you wake up and you finally have your wits and you want to observe the Shabbos. What do you do?
Do it every day.
Well, no, that's impractical, right? So it says, well, you don't know. You're separate from society. You count 7 days and that's feast. That's what Talmud says. And then I heard I don't remember the details of the story, but someone says, no, like what they would do is they would just wait till they feel it and they know when it's Shabbos. So it's this idea that it's going to be imperceptible for most, but for the people that have the spiritual sensitivity, to them, they can feel it. They have the antenna, and therefore, they pick up the signal. Such an interesting idea about Israel to begin with.
Well, that would be the same like if you're going into a synagogue.
Water.
You're going into synagogue for service, you get this feeling, or during the holidays, you walk in the synagogue with other people around, and all of a sudden that'd be the same kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I'm saying holiness is one of the central aspects of Jewish life. The high holidays, right? They're called the high holies. They're days when we are more likely to be sensitive to these spiritual realities that are there and present. I want to give us an example of this, just to make this a little more practical. We find in the following verse in Leviticus. Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18 is a very famous chapter because it deals with all the forbidden sexual relationships that someone is allowed to have, or not allowed to have, prohibited. And it goes through the whole list, and then it gives us 5 verses at the end of the repercussions of what would happen if people do these things. And I'm going to quote here. Ooh, my iPad just restarted. Okay, so I'm not going to quote. I'll paraphrase until it turns back on. So it says like this. It says, don't defile yourself in all these various ways. Right? Don't sin in all these sins that were enumerated in the previous verses. Why? Because if you do, the land will vomit you out. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. The people that are currently in the land of Israel, right? The Torah tells the Jewish people, the people that are there now, they sinned with all the sins that we just recently enumerated. And because the land was defiled, I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you, Jewish people, you keep the Torah, and you observe these laws, and don't do these things, because all the people that were here, that lived there before you, they did it, the land became defiled, and if you do the same thing, you too will be vomited out of the land. Which is a very bizarre statement, but essentially Jewish people are told the reason why the people that are in the land now are going to be displaced and you're going to take their place is because they sinned, and the land has an immune system that it can't bear such sin, and expels them. And you too, you're going in, it's the same land, and it's that same immune system. You sin in it, the land will expel you.
Hopefully I'm not jumping the gun, Rabbi, but okay, you're saying the people there now, 2015, which have returned after the first vomiting, so to speak, or whatever, or dispersal. Not everybody is observant there. So is it saying they're going to be vomited out again, or is the Messiah
Well,
going to intervene
well, that's a
before
good
that?
question. That's a good question. But we look at history, and we see the Jewish people being expelled multiple times from the land of Israel, which is a historical phenomenon that has not happened many times.
So it could
now,
happen again.
does that mean, of course it could happen again. Does that mean that it happens right away? Of course not. We know that any of the predictions in the Torah of you do bad and you'll get punished, there's always some time, leeway for you to rectify your ways. We know with Noah, right? Noah, right? In the Noah, the flood story, the Almighty tells Noah that they have 120 years now to fix themselves. So there is a lot of flexibility, but
Sure,
it's
but
not
that was
forever.
Before Israel, right?
That's true. That's
And
just an
Noah
example.
wasn't even Jewish, was he?
That's right. He was not Jewish.
Okay.
But clearly, what we're told here that our control of the land, or anyone's control of the land of Israel, is conditional. If they defile the land will send them packing. And we see in history that when they did defile the land, they got packing. Now, it didn't take, it didn't happen instantly, it didn't happen overnight, but it happened, and we happened multiple times, and that's because the land itself has spiritual sensitivity. So we don't have this anywhere else. We don't have that. We might have some other sensitivities in the land, but the land itself is holy. There's a spiritual nature to the land that precludes it from being a haven for a nation of sinners. And that's why the people before you were expelled, and you too, you will be expelled if you behave the way they do.
Yeah, I read just that book that you recommended on Lashon Hara.
Yes.
So he was just, the passage last week was that during that time, Hashem was extremely patient watching all this, but when we started speaking Lashon Hara towards each other, that's when it was like, that's when it's all over.
Mm-hmm.
Gossip.
Yeah,
Gossip.
just being ill-spotted towards being, talking about each other, hatred towards each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's actually interesting because in the Talmud talks about the first temple versus the second temple. We look at the temple as being the epicenter of Jewish settlement in Israel. And both times when the Jews were exiled, the exile and the dispersal was punctuated by destroying the temple as well. So the first time by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, if you heard that name, and the second time by the Romans, or Titus and Vespasian. But both times the Jewish people were expelled, but it started off with, or a part of the, in Jewish, in the Jewish perception, we look at the destroying of the temple as being the final death knell for the settlement.
Well, for
But
heaven's sake, Rabbi, they're having idolaters worship in the temple. How much can the man take anyway?
well, yeah, I agree. I wouldn't label him as a man, but
Wow.
yeah, I know what you
How
mean.
much responsibility, and I know that's probably not the greatest of words, but how much responsibility does rabbinic leadership have as opposed to an individual for such a thing as that?
Like what?
Well, the idolatrous going to.
Yeah, but what's also interesting is that when we go down collectively. You can't say, oh, because you're the prophet Ezekiel and you're a wonderful guy, that you don't get swept away with everyone else,
I
right?
understand that you get swept away, but is there not a hierarchy of why things fall and the responsibility?
Well, of course. If someone has outsized responsibility, if they're one of the great leaders and one of the rabbis, one of the respected people, then they're going to be have more responsibility to ensure that everyone's behaving, properly.
So what happened with the temple? Why did the rabbis allow such goings on?
Well, they didn't necessarily. They didn't. But there were a lot of factions that were not loyal to the rabbis or not loyal to tradition. We know that. We'll talk about that as well today. How
Could an argument be made, and this may be getting a little off the subject, that Jesus may have been even more Jewish, quote unquote, in that respect than some others, because of the story of he overturned the temple when he saw all the.
Talking about the money changers?
Yeah, that was just one thing. I think there was a lot of I don't think it was just money changing that was going on.
No, but he
at that.
clearly had problems with temple leadership.
Well, so you're turning my father's house into a.
Yeah, well, but the
league,
temple
so-
leadership at that time was not the rabbis. It was not the kind of the traditional perspective. It was the Sadducees.
Right.
The Sadducees sold out, you know.
The Sadducees.
They-
What about the other group?
The Pharisees.
Pharisees.
The
yeah.
Pharisees are the name that that's for the mainstream Jewish community, which incidentally, it's they weren't called they didn't call themselves Pharisees. You know, but what does the word Pharisee mean? I don't know where the word comes from. The word comes from the Hebrew word Perushim. Parush means someone who abstains. What it means is that there were a lot of new innovations. They were, and if you call them innovations, we call them regressions. But the Sadducees say, "Oh, we have a new innovation. We'll do it this way." And the Essenes says, "Oh, we have a new innovation. We'll do it this way." And the Judeo-Christians, they say, "Oh, we have a new innovation. We'll do it that way." And the people that say, "I'm withholding. I just want to keep it the way it always was," they're called the Perushim. They withheld from all the different factions, and they're called the Pharisees. But they're actually no different. They're not a new group. I would say similarly in
Silent majority, right?
Huh?
It's
I don't know if it's silent. I don't know if they were majority at the time. They weren't necessarily majority, but they weren't. They were the ones who were sticking to tradition. I would make the argument. It's not an argument. It's clear that the term Orthodox, right? So that term is a new term. We don't find that before the 19th century. But what does it refer to? It refers to someone who's not reform or conservative, whatever, right? But it's not a new movement per se. It's essentially the Jews who are sticking to tradition. So the temple leadership at the time were the Sadducees. They were always the elite and the Kohanic
They were the
people.
ones that were changing, they were making changes.
Oh, that's why we talk about in the Second Temple there was a lot of corruption because the people that were running the temple were actually not in line. You can read very interesting if you look at the Mishnah, the book that talks about what happened on Yom Kippur. You read about the rabbis having to negotiate with the high priest to make sure he does everything correctly because the Sadducees would come and they would corrupt the service. And all the Jews are relying on the Kohen Gadol, on the high priest, and that was a position sold to the highest bidder, and they wouldn't necessarily do everything properly. And it was a disaster. And then I have to talk to him, make sure you're the representative of the people, and you have to do it. And if you do it wrong, you're gonna, we're all gonna suffer together. And then it would say that even if he wasn't a Sadducee, they would tell him the same thing, and then he would start crying because they accused him of being a Sadducee, and they would cry because they have to go through such a terrible vetting process to make sure that the most important day, the most important service by the most important leader of the people is done correctly. So to answer your question,
This is a fine kettle of fish they found themselves.
yes, and that all culminated in essentially civil war, and then the Romans say, "Oh, you guys want to kill each other? We'll do the job for you." And that's why we say that the Second Temple destroyed sinat chinam, a senseless hatred, baseless hatred from one Jew to another. Either way, back to our introduction.
We never get past it.
Yeah, we're gonna get past it. Just we won't necessarily do it as thoroughly or slowly
We're
as.
supposed to get to Bibi at some point,
We're gonna get to Bibi today. I assure you.
and we're still in the biblical text.
My wife went to school with the Bibi and his brother.
Oh, is that right in Boston?
No,
He went to-
Philadelphia, Cheltenham. Town.
Oh! Not
What's
to
MIT
university.
too?
Yeah, he went down there, but this was high school.
That's right. His the '60s. He lived there. He lived in Israel. He lived in Philadelphia. That's right. Okay, so what's a Jewish claim to the land? This is very important because the very first verse in the Torah, Rashi, the great commentator, asked the question. He says, "Hey, the Torah is a book of laws and instructions. Why is it necessary to give us the story of Genesis, the story of Noah, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the tribes and the Exodus? Well, just give us the laws. Start from the laws and just make it a book of laws as it is purported to be." And he says, because we have to establish our claim to the land of Israel. When we want to move into Israel, the Gentiles say, "Hey, who are you to come in the land? We'll say, well, we have a document that is our deed to the land. That's Genesis. Because look, the Almighty created it, and then he tells, it created the whole world, and Israel as well. Therefore, he's the rightful owner. And he says to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob, each one of them gets the same blessing that your descendants are going to have, the land of Israel. And look, we are those descendants, and therefore the land is ours. And interestingly, we know that Ben Gurion himself made that claim, despite the fact that, maybe he didn't necessarily behave in a way that demonstrated that he believed that it was a divine document, but that has been traditionally our claim to the land. Now, we also have claim based upon international law as well. We captured it just like the Americans captured Texas, right? Or they annexed Texas. How does that work? That's the way it works. Is that, what makes us the rightful owners of Kentucky? Why? Because that's the way it works. When you capture it, you own it. So if we capture the land in 1948 and 49, well, then it's ours. I don't want to get bogged down by the details, but that we have a historical claim and we have also a political claim to land as well. Now, we know, last element before we get into history, we know that there are many mitzvahs that are only applicable in the land of Israel. In fact, outside the land of Israel, the maximum amount of mitzvahs that some can do is around 130. So we talk about 613. The only way to get anywhere close to that number is actually in the land of Israel. Point being that the intention of the mitzvahs were that they would be fulfilled in the land of Israel. And incidentally, we might have mentioned this prior, in some discussion we had prior, Jacob and the forefathers as well, they only observed the Torah before it was given in the land of Israel. Thus, how was he allowed to marry two sisters? The Torah says very clearly, you can't marry two sisters. Well, it was outside the land of Israel. They're about to enter the land of Israel. Rachel has to die. Because she was the one who encroached upon that, because he married Leah first. Rachel has to die on the doorstep of Israel.
Are there any negative commandments only with Israel, or is it just the positive commandments?
Well, there are like the Shemitah. We taught this with the Shemitah, right? The don't plant, don't sow, don't reap, don't harvest. That's in the land of Israel.
Well, that's not negative, is it?
Well, it's a prohibition. It's not negative, it's a prohibition. Yeah, it's a prohibition. But there are many, many examples. All the laws of purity and impurity, what you can eat, what you cannot eat, all the sacrifices, all that stuff only applies to the land of Israel.
Wait
Many
a
of
minute,
them are.
you're saying what you can eat and cannot
No,
eat?
not the kosher laws. I'm saying the laws with regards to sacrifices, right? So, if you go to the temple with an animal and you say, "Oh, I want lunch," right? So you bring the animal to the temple and they make you a steak. You got to eat that, right? But you got to eat it in Jerusalem. You have to eat it a certain amount of time. You have to eat it in a certain status of of physical and spiritual purity. All those laws, and there are many of them, apply only in the land of Israel. My grandfather once said this line. I think it's interesting for the context of our discussion. He says the Jewish people they left Egypt, and 49 days later, they got the Torah. So the Jews need 49 days to prepare for the Torah, and they needed 40 years to prepare for Israel. Interesting. So let's start with Abraham. Abraham, as we know in Genesis, is instructed to go to the land of Israel. He travels the land. He goes up and down, And when I was in Israel, I was telling my kids on the phone, I said, this is the place where Abraham walked. How remarkable is that? And by the way, there's a mitzvah to settle the land of Israel. And that is, you get a mitzvah every 4 cubits you walk in the land of Israel. So every 8 feet that you walk in the land of Israel, it's a mitzvah. And this is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived and walked. We know that Isaac never left. But Abraham left when there was a famine. So Abraham leaves. Jacob leaves as well to go to Egypt. Jacob goes to get married. And by the way, from these storylines, we find out that when are we allowed to leave the land of Israel? There's a mitzvah to live in the land. What are we doing in Houston, Texas? Right? So, Jacob left to get married. So if you're in the land of Israel and you want your spouse is elsewhere, well, then that would be a good reason to leave. Right? Abraham leaves because there's no food. If there's no economy, you can't make a living, right? That's a reason to live elsewhere. But the Jewish attitude is always, we live in Israel unless we can't. It's not like, oh, it would be wonderful to go visit or to go live in Israel. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The default status is that we live in the land of Israel. If we can't live for whatever reason, well, then we can leave, but not the other way around. As we know, the people end up the Jewish family ends up in Egypt with the Joseph story. We're going to read it actually in this week's parsha. They all end up there, 70 men, 70 souls, and they're there for a couple of 100 years. And the small fledgling tribe has burgeoned into a nation. And we know the Exodus story. I want to talk about the Exodus story because we're talking about Israel right now. They spent 40 years to read the Torah. It's a wonderful book. And Moshe dies on the doorstep of Israel. Joshua's the new leader, and he leads them into the land of Israel. And we know there's been 14 years in conquest and division of the land. Very importantly, they offer peace terms to every city they encounter, every nation they encounter. They offer peace terms. And some nations accepted the peace terms, some didn't, and war resulted. So we know the first battle was the Battle of Jericho. And, actually, interestingly, Jericho was a very, very heavily fortified city. How would a nation of recently liberated slaves, how are they going to capture the city of Jericho? So we know, you read the story, that they actually did it in miraculous fashion. Because the nation at that time was worthy of being treated with miracles. Therefore, and miracles were no big deal. Therefore, they were able to capture Jericho miraculously. Now, what happens when we look back? It's possible we could find some tremors or some evidence of an enormous earthquake that just subdued the city and knocked down the walls, and we were able to walk in and capture. Yeah, but a perfectly timed earthquake is a miracle. A perfectly timed tornado that splits the sea is a miracle. That's how we define miracles. Perfectly timed natural events that aren't that frequent. So the Jewish people enter the land, and the land there's no major empire dominating the land. We know that up till recent history, the world or the known inhabited world is essentially a game of musical chairs between these enormous empires. So at the time we have the Egyptian Empire, we have what's called the Mesopotamian Empire. We mean a lot of other empires as well. But Israel is kind of sandwiched between these massive empires, and we don't really have a dominant empire. In fact, we have multiple little what we call city-states, right? 31 of them, 7 different nations, 31 different city-states. Each one of them has a king. Each one of them has an army. Each one of them is well fortified, and each one of them is going to be a thorn in the side of this new emerging nation, the Israelites. Eventually, after 14 years, they capture, they kind of have a conquest of the majority of the land. But for the next roughly 400 years, the period that's recorded in the book of Joshua and Judges, primarily Judges, we're going to have a reality where the Jews have the land, or most of the land. They don't have Jerusalem. They don't have all the land, and they're in constant battle and skirmishes with these other nations, like the Philistines. We know the great thorn in the side of the Jews. That period of the time of the period of Judges, we also do not have a king. So the leader of the nation is going to be one of the judges. There's 16 judges, Joshua being the first judge, Samuel being the last judge, and that transforms into the era of kings. Right? Samuel is the one who's going to anoint the first king of Israel. But other prophets in the interim, we have the prophet Deborah, or Deborah, right? That name. We actually had a female prophet. How's that for being progressive and being egalitarian? If the woman is the one who is most capable of leading the people, and then she's the one who is going to be nominated, going to be the leader. We have, of course, famous names that you may know, Gideon or Samson battling with the Philistines, etc., etc. But the last line of the book of Judges kind of sums up this period, that there was no king, there was anarchy and chaos, and ish hayashar be'einav yaseh. Everyone did what was right in their eyes. So while you had the land, most of the land, you didn't have Israel, you didn't have a temple. You had a kind of this minor temple in a place called Shiloh. And you don't have the kind of security and prosperity in the fullest sense of the words. And then we meet a fellow by the name of Saul. Right? Saul is going to become the first king of Israel. And that's going to usher into the era of kings, as recorded in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. And it's a very interesting story how Samuel actually anoints the new king. And that is because Saul, the great scholar, the great military leader, right, head and shoulders above all his peers, he actually lost his donkeys. And he lost his donkeys. What do you do when you lose your donkeys? You go to the local prophet. Right? The prophets served not only a spiritual role, they served a very practical, pragmatic role. Right? They were the ones who knew, and they could tell you, hey, which major should I choose? Right? Confounding questions for a lot of people. Which area of business or which vocation shall I choose? Which is a good question. A lot of people have. People had that in ancient times as well, and instead of taking the best guess or having to try to think, they would just go to the prophet. Simple.
So you said donkey meant physicality, so do you mean?
Oh, well, no, I think he might have just been a donkey, right? So Saul is looking for the donkey. He goes to Samuel. Samuel tells him where the donkey is. Oh, by the way, you're the new king of Israel. And he takes the special oil and he pours it over his head. And that's the process of anointing a king.
What about the donkeys? The guy wanted his donkey.
And he got the donkeys as well, but now he got a lot more. And Saul is what we know as the perfect picturesque. We have the primary season now, right? So we're looking to try to find candidates to represent our two parties.
But
We
wasn't
already
Saul
have a
also
bunch of
crazy?
donkeys.
We'll get to that.
That's later.
And we're always
Only
looking.
on one party side.
We're looking for the perfect candidate. Someone who is charismatic, someone who is intelligent, someone who knows the issues, who's a little bit of a want, but not too much of a want, someone who's personable.
A bit bipolar.
Exactly. Whatever, right? Someone who's crazy enough to want the job. Right? That's what we're looking for.
Trump.
We're not going down there, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay. But Saul, if you were to create a king in a lab, it would look like Saul. He was a great scholar. He was a great warrior. He had the gravitas of a king. He was everything. He was cookie cutter perfection. And we know that his reign was a disaster. It was tragedy from beginning to end. And we'll see this as a theme that's recurring, wherein the leaders of the Jews are not necessarily the ones that you would say from the onset, these are the people that are designed and engineered to be great leaders. And the polar opposite of that is King David. King David's own family,
Was a
like,
mess.
it was a mess, but he was an afterthought. He was the kid that everyone would say, he was the black sheep of his own family. He was the kid that said that his own sibling said would amount to nothing. And he's the one who's the model of a great Jewish king. And he's the one from whom all kings, all future kings, and the Messianic line comes through. So the quick story here with Saul is that Saul made a crucial mistake. The prophet tells him that the Almighty wants him to smite the nation of Amalek, or Amalek. And he does that, but he spares the king, and he spares a bunch of cows. When when the prophet tells you, I want you to exterminate and wipe out this nation, because this nation is a bunch of Hitlers, you do it. Right? And then when you kill the cows, you kill the cows. Don't say, oh, well, the cows are, they're harmless. Yeah, you may think they're harmless. The prophet tells you, you listen to the prophet. He spears the king of Amalek, whose name is Agag, who goes on to father a child that is going to be the antecedent of Haman. And the prophet Samuel himself hunts down Agag and kills him himself, but the traces of Amalek will continue and will cause tremendous pain and suffering for the Jewish people. Samuel goes back to Saul, says, okay, you know what? You're done. Your monarchy has ended. In God's view, you're no longer the king. And then we have this transitional period where Samuel goes to find a new king, and he finds David. But Saul still has the throne, still has the army, and still has the monarchy. And everyone still thinks that Saul is the king, and he doesn't want to relinquish his throne. Right? In Samuel's view, he's no longer the king. And in God's view, he's no longer the king. And Samuel goes and he finds David. We know the story. He goes to Jesse's family, and he finds David. And he says to Jesse, he says, hey, one of your kids is going to be the king. So he presents the oldest one. No, not this one, not this one, and this one. All of them. So is there any more? Yeah. There's the Gingy, as they say. There's the redhead in the backyard. He's wasting his time, shepherding. He plays music. Not the right guy. He says, well, let me just take a look at him. And he takes a look at him. He sees his hair's red, and he gets a little nervous. But he sees his eyes are blue, we're told. And he says, these beautiful eyes, and he'll be the kind of the visionary. He'll follow the visionaries, even though his hair reminds us of Esau. He has a violent streak to him. And he anoints him as well. Now David's the king in God's view, and Saul is the king in the people's view. And that does not necessarily go without conflict. And David demonstrates tremendous heroism. We know the David and Goliath story. Saul is essentially enchanted by David, but also terrified of him because he knows that David could mean the end of his reign. And he makes an announcement: whoever gets me 100 foreskins of Philistines, I'm going to give him my daughter Michal. Now, how do you extract a foreskin off a Philistine? You got to kill him first, right? Because they don't usually. There's no donation center like a plasma. Donate your plasma, donate your blood, and donate your foreskin. That doesn't work, at least not in ancient times. So David goes and gets not 100, he gets 200 foreskins, right? And then Saul says, I'm actually not going to be my daughter. Sorry. So David essentially is married to Saul's daughter, Michal, but he marries her off to someone else. Because he kind of reneges on his pledge. Either way, eventually Saul dies. And the guy comes, tells David, I've got great news. Saul is dead. And David gets terribly down because Saul was a great leader, and Saul was called Mashiach Hashem, the Messiah of Hashem. But eventually David is the undisputed king of Israel. By the way, just a little quick note. The term Mashiach, right? The term Mashiach means anointed one, because the Meshuach means to anoint someone with oil. Thus, and the Greek word Christos means anointed. So the term Christ that we have does not mean anything, does not mean Son of God or any of that nonsense. It means anointed one. Now, because the Christian claim that their Lord and Savior was the anointed one. Jewish claim, we reject that. But it doesn't mean, that means the term has nothing to do with divinity of any sort.
So it would be accurate, would it not, to call David Christos, right?
That's what he's called. David is called Mashiach Hashem. That's what David is called, Mashiach.
And Saul was.
Saul was as well. He was the king. By the way, high priests were also anointed. And they're also called Meshuach. Meshuach means that they're anointed, but there's different kinds of high priests. There's high priests that are only anointed for war, so they're called Meshuach Muhammad. means they're anointed for war. But the word Mashiach, all it means is that was the ancient, at least Jewish process of inaugurating new leaders. I want to just stop for a second and look at just a theme that we mentioned earlier, but now we'll look at it in great detail. We have this week's parsha. We have this in the parsha of we have the story of Judah and Tamar.
We talked about this.
I know, one of your favorites. Well, what actually is going on? It's unclear, but essentially Judah he has a relationship with what he thinks is a random prostitute. Turns out it's his ex-daughter-in-law, and they produce twins.
Not ex-daughter-in-law.
Well,
Still the daughter-in-law.
well, no, but his two sons had died. Okay, right. He had former daughters-in-law, but now still daughters-in-law, still daughter-in-law, but actually the husband, Judah's son, is dead. And then you read the story, read the episode, it's very bizarre. Like something's wrong. Like something's off here. Something's off. Like why would Judah go and solicit a random? Why would she get dressed up as a prostitute? The whole story doesn't make any sense. Very bizarre. But when you look a little bit at the sources that talk about the story, they talk about this is the process of redemption. Redemption has to happen in these circuitous, unconventional ways. Because we think of redemption as being, marching through the city square. That's not the way redemption. Redemption happens in these ways that are like almost shameful and scandalous, and ways that no one would ever consider to be redemptive, and therefore they have the ability to do that. So we find this again and again. We find this with the story of Judah and Tamar, and they produce the twins, which are going to be the forebearers of the Messiah. If you follow that line a little further, we have Boaz and Ruth. Ruth is a convert, and her husband is dead as well, and she essentially is really poor, so she's collecting grain in the field, and Boaz notices her, and she goes in the middle of the night, snuggles up with him, and he eventually marries. Like, what's going on over here? Boaz is the leader of the people, and who is this woman, and why is she snuggling up to him? What's the deal here? No problem. And that progeny that is produced, right? Oved, the father of Yishai, the father of David. So David's great-grandmother is Ruth, and the episode that brought about that was something that we would say is a little scandalous. And we see it again. Even Moses. Moses, the leader, right? The leader of the people, right? Oh, who is going to be the guy to lead us out of the land of Israel? Let's go look. Someone who's with Pharaoh, who grows up with Pharaoh, that's the right guy to lead? Seems bizarre. King David, he's the guy? Surprising. David and Bathsheba, another favorite of Janet, right? That's the relationship that's going to produce Solomon, who's going to continue the Davidic monarchy line. And dare I say, this might be a little controversial, Theodore Herzl is going to be the one who's going to bring the Jews back to the land of Israel? Who's Theodore Herzl? He's someone who didn't give his own kid a circumcision. He didn't speak Hebrew, knew nothing about Judaism. He also proposed to have mass conversion to Christianity in 1890. This is the guy? It's a good question.
Has there ever been any, and I don't know how to say this, any study as to why sexuality plays such a strong role throughout every story? Whether it's Judah and Tamar, or whether it's David and Bathsheba, or whether it's Boaz and Ruth. There's a sexual, there's an element to
Well, I'm saying the story that we're highlighting, the aspect of the stories that we're highlighting is the fact that, the progeny that was produced from what we would say is odd unions, is the family of the Messiah, and the family of David, and the family of the kings, that royalty. That's where scandals happen, right?
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Through all of these people that we now perceive
Yeah, I wouldn't say that necessarily, but
Not much has changed.
let me. I'm hesitant of going, that approach.
It's the transformative process, though, that you're talking about, where greatness comes. They don't wake up one day and find greatness. They evolve into it. They step into it.
We step up to the plate. But
They step up
I think
to
that,
the plate.
let me tell you what happened with Judah and Tamar according to the Jewish perspective, the traditional Jewish perspective.
Yeah.
There is a midrash that talks about what happened with Judah and Tamar, and it says that the angel who oversees desire, he came to Judah and he turned up the volume to such a degree that it withdrew his capacity for free will. Essentially, the idea being, or the theme being, that God is manipulating Judah because God wants this union to happen. Judah would never agree if he had the say in the matter. And essentially, this is the unconventional ways. That's the only way for our nation to really have these transformations that are brought about by these great episodes, or these great individuals that are born out of these relationships. But it's still very interesting. The point is, that we see this theme again and again, and it's just interesting. My takeaway is the fact that bombastic proclamations, or traditional avenues of change that we would imagine as being transformative don't actually work. Real change on such a transformative level happens in a way that you would never imagine. You would never telegraph that as a way for things to really change.
But isn't Judah also the one who does acknowledge his
Oh yeah. Well, there's a whole story, of course.
Isn't he the one that also gets the most land in Israel? Isn't the tribe of Judah given the largest?
Well, Judah is the family of kings, of royalty. Judah's leader. Either way, let's we're at oh goodness.
Bibi still waits.
Bibi is awaiting. We will get him, I assure you. Okay. So then we have the era of David and Solomon. This is what we call the golden age. This is the zenith of Jewish settlement and land. They have righteous kings. They have peace. They have secure borders. Right? David captures Jerusalem. Right? There's finally the unified land of Israel. There was prosperity. There's peace. Things are so wonderful that Talmud tells us that they actually didn't accept converts during those 80 years, because converts are people that choose, based upon principle, sincerely, to join the nation. Well, if the nation is just so wonderful and so everything's so fantastic that anyone would want to join, well, then we can't determine sincerity. And therefore, they took a hiatus of taking converts. Interesting. They capture... they capture Jerusalem. David actually makes it his mission to actually purchase Temple Mount. He doesn't want to capture it. He doesn't want to have anyone to have any claims on that piece of land. He does not get to build it. His son Solomon gets to build it. And Solomon's temple, the first temple, this is fine. We have arrived. Right? We're at we're at the apex. Thank you. Of what it was all meant to be. We're there. Unfortunately, it doesn't last that long. And Solomon reigns for 40 years as well. He dies at the tender age of 52. He becomes king at the age of 12. Ain't that a nice bar mitzvah present? And he, of course, is one of the great leaders that we've ever had. But he dies at the age of 52, and his son Rechavam becomes the king. And here is where maybe the most tragic episode in all of Jewish history happens. Or development. Rechavam is a young whippersnapper, and he is presented with a dilemma. We have the temple, we have Jerusalem, we have the capital in southern Israel, essentially. And we have most of the Jews, lots and lots of Jews living all across the land of Israel. You have Jews all the way in the north, and they feel removed, like it's kind of like the people in the cities versus the people in the rural areas of every state that we have in the United States. They feel a little bit out of it. Which, by the way, incidentally, the reason why all the state capitals were not in the biggest city, if you take the biggest city of any state, it's typically not the capital. Is because the people that were elsewhere, they wanted to have a bigger say. They knew that if New York City was the capital of New York State, then all the people that lived elsewhere, they wouldn't be represented adequately. But that kind of tension existed there as well. You have the people in Jerusalem where the temple is. They have people that came to visit the temple once in a while, but they were outside. They're outsiders. They were living in suburbia. They were living elsewhere. And Rechavam, who's the new king, he was presented with options. Should he try to court them and try to engage them more, or should he try to penalize them? And unfortunately, he chose the latter. He penalized them, puts punitive taxes on the people living in the north, and they rebel and secede. That's the short story. They
why did
secede.
you want to penalize them?
No, to kind of put them in their place.
What was the logic there?
The logic is that to be a strong leader, you have to make sure people recognize and appreciate your dominion. And people are not going to say, we're not listening to you. Who are you? Some young new king. Solomon, he was worthy. You're not worthy. Oh, yeah, I'm not worthy? I'll show you who's worthy, right? That's the attitude. Unfortunately, it was the wrong attitude. He should have courted them more. He was very fierce with them, and they seceded, and they formed what's known as the kingdom of Israel in the north, and the kingdom of Judah is what was left in the south. Now, this terrible, terrible event spiraled out of control, right? There were efforts, of course, to try to reunify Israel. Unfortunately, they all failed, and we had the southern kingdom of Judah with the temple, the northern kingdom of Israel without the temple, but the leadership realized that if the Jews were allowed to go visit the temple, they would get inspired. So they said, screw it, we'll build our own temple. And they built their own temple. Unfortunately, you now build your own temple. And also they built a temple for Baal, the idol. And we have 180 years, give or take, of the northern kingdom of Israel descending further and further down the death spirals of idolatry. And you have the prophets like Elijah trying to bring them back, and the whole episode with him in Mount Carmel. But you have successive kings that each one of them maybe had great promise, but ultimately they did not withstand the test, and idolatry reigned supreme, and God's patience, so to speak, weared thin, and he brought upon them one of the mightiest empires of all time, the Assyrian Empire. Now, our perceptions of grandiosity of empires cannot fathom how mighty this empire was, and they had one of their policies was when you capture a nation, you relocate them in order that they won't suppress them, they won't rebel. So we have the great Sancherib. He comes from the north, from Assyria, and he captures and relocates all the Jews of the kingdom of Israel. And if you've ever heard the term of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that is the nation of Israel, northern kingdom of Israel, that Sancherib, he captured and reassigned them elsewhere. They're gone. We don't know what they are. They left the land of Israel. Other people were sent to their place.
Why did the Syrians stop at the northern kingdom? Why
They
go
didn't.
south?
They didn't. And they went south, and they captured a lot of cities, but didn't capture. They actually surrounded. They surrounded Jerusalem, and we have the accounting of it as well in the Torah, in the Bible, and it tells of a great plague that's smote the older soldiers, and they all died. And we looked at it as a miracle, like a plague, an outbreak of influenza or malaria, whatever, that kills a whole army or disables an army. You may look at it today and say, it's just fortuitous that they had a plague that killed them all, right? We look at that as a miracle. that because the Almighty was not ready to destroy Jerusalem, the people were not deserving of destruction, therefore they can't be captured. And we actually have today, it's amazing, we actually have, in the British Museum, I actually copied this last night from the internet, we actually have these great prisms that they wrote. We still have them today. You can go to London and actually read these things. And it says as follows. As for the king of Judah, he talks about his capture of the kingdom of Israel. This is Sancherib talking. As for the king of Judah, Chistia, who has not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns, taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder 200,000 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. As for Chistia, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I had captured, I gave to the kings of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza. It mentions nothing of capturing Jerusalem. And by the way, this account mirrors the Jewish account. We found this recently. This is a new thing.
Where were these prisms found?
They were probably found in somewhere in Mesopotamia. When the British Empire captured everything, they just took everything and they said, "Okay, we're bringing it to London. Come, you want to come get it? Good luck." But we mentioned there's no mention of in Jewish literature we find also that Sancherib has a siege in the city, but he doesn't actually capture it. And indeed, the southern kingdom of Judah would outlast the Assyrians and would actually be taken down by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, which is the great empire that emerged afterwards.
So where are the Assyrians today?
The Assyrians are gone. All the great. Where are the Babylonians? They're gone. They're all gone.
There have to be some remnants.
Well, Assyria is a region, right? We know that the Assyrian Greeks as well. There's another great empire that emerged, 400 years later, in the same region, but not the same. It's not the same empire. We find this again and again in history, where you have an empire that lasts for maybe 300-400 years, and is so dominant, and and it's so secure, and it has everything, and it has such dominance, but doesn't last, and it's taken over by some other great empire. And by the way, we're still here. And there's been hundreds and hundreds of nations from throughout history that were just like us. They were small, had links to certain territory, were captured by a great empire, and are gone. And yet we survive, which is a great, historical anomaly. Either way, the 10 years before the destruction of the first temple, we have Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonians sending a contingency of 10,000 Jews to exile in Babylon. And this is another great theme that we find in Jewish history, which is that the healing comes before the injury. When God wants to injure the Jewish people, right, he first lays the groundwork for the rebirth and rebuilding before the injury. So before the people of Judah were destroyed, before the temple was destroyed and all the people are sent scattering, there's a contingency of 10,000 of the best and brightest of the Jewish people sent to Babylon. They laid the groundwork for what's going to be a tremendously fruitful and flourishing civilization the Jews are going to establish in Babylon. And then 10 years later, when the exile actually happens and all the Jews transition to Babylon, they come and they find Jewish schools and Jewish shuls, and there's a bagel store in every corner, and there's a vibrant Jewish life that they can very easily transition into. This may be controversial, but I think we can make the argument that this emergence of the Zionist movement, the political and religious confluence that kind of sparks up out of nowhere, really, in the 19th century, once again from very unconventional individuals, and gains a very strong backing, and starts the resettlement of the land of Israel, which was was unimaginable to the people living in the 14th century, the 15th century, 16th century, 8th century, 9th century. Like, you have pockets of people going to the land of Israel, but a movement of a nation is trying to reestablish a homeland. You don't find that till the 1890s. We can make the argument that that's laying the groundwork for what's going to be the tremendous injury that happened to the Jews in Europe, where after the tremendous injury, well, there already is the political groundwork and the agricultural groundwork and the religious groundwork for establishing a state in Israel. And you know what? We have 6 million Jews living in Israel today, which is remarkable. When throughout the most recent 2,000 years, we had several thousand Jews living in Israel, but no substantial community. Now, almost overnight, historically, we have 6 million Jews. And we could, if we zoom out and we don't ask any questions, because questions are problematic, because a lot of really bad things happened to the Jews in the past 150 years, but we zoom out 150 years and look how the nation transformed. How essentially you have Jews living in Europe 150 years ago, and then there's the settlement of Jews in the United States, and the settlement of Jews in Israel, and now you have almost no Jews living in Europe, and the ones that are there want to escape, and you have Jews living in the United States.
3 million in Europe.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's primarily Jews in France. So France is an enormous. Yeah, but you have Jews in England as well,
French Jews are leaving.
and they're all leaving in
Yeah,
enormous
it's like
numbers.
4,000 a year, it's not...
It's still pretty significant. It's still pretty significant.
The Germans are
the
inviting
rich
Jews
ones,
back.
Oh, we just have some bad blood. You know what I mean? Moving right along. We're going to go a little faster now, okay, guys? So the Jewish people have an exile. This one exile lasts really essentially 70 years. Jews living in Babylon. Ezra takes a continuity of 42,000 Jews. He reestablishes Jewish settlement 70 years later. But from then on, you're going to have dual communities, one in Israel and one in Babylon, for about 1,000 years. Ezra goes and reestablishes the life in the land of Israel. He rebuilds the temple. The second temple is not quite the same in grandeur as the first temple, but it's still a temple on Temple Mount. They do establish some sort of sovereignty, even though it's not complete. They're going to be under the thumb of the various empires at the time. It's going to be the Persian Empire. Of course, we know after the Persian Empire came the Greek Empire, and of course, the unforgettable Ptolemy Empire and the Seleucid Empire of Egypt and Assyria, respectively. And, of course, our favorites, the Romans. Either way, over that time, we're going to see essentially a transition where the kings are no longer dominant. The Sanhedrin is going to take an outsized responsibility. The men of the Great Assembly are going to establish the ground rules for a nation that is A, divided, B, some Jews living in Israel, some live in Babylon, B, the end of prophecy, C, the downgrading of the temple, where you don't no longer have the ever-present miracles, and also, lastly, what do we do when we have a nation where central authority is not as dominant? You don't have a king, you don't have a prophet. So what do you have? You have the religious leadership, and that's going to be the central authority of the land. So we're going to see an increase of importance transferred from the monarchy and the prophecy to what's the Sanhedrin, which is essentially the Supreme Court or the religious authority in the land. But of course, once we don't have that same dominant leadership in the form of kings and prophets, that opens the door for a lot of dissent and a lot of sectarianism. And we're going to meet these different groups, these Hellenists and the Sadducees and all the people we talked about. Israel's now a breeding ground for anyone who says, oh, I have a new idea. I want to challenge this part of traditional Jewish thought, or I want to challenge that part. Now the floodgates are open. And the Second Temple era, there's a tremendous tension between these different groups. On one hand, you have the rabbis, we call them Pharisees if you would like, and they want to stay the course, so to speak. They want to maintain the Torah values, the written Torah, the oral Torah. And you have a Sadducees say, oh, the written Torah is fantastic, But it's all literal. It's all literal, and we cannot rely on our traditional methods of understanding the Torah. And that's a disaster because you have Jews living next door to each other, neighbors, and they observe a different religion. And tremendous tension. Of course, we know that the Greeks, they come and they become the hosts, and we have the story of Hanukkah. That's happens in the land of Israel. It's once again shows what happens when you have the sovereignty of a foreign nation, yet the ritualistic and religion of a different nation, and they're at odds with each other. So, of course, we know there's culture wars, religious wars between the Jews and the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, want to invoke as much idolatry as they can into Jewish life. They want to focus on humanism, which is the human is not at the center of the Jewish worldview. God's always at the center. And the Greeks come with their ideas, and they say, "Hey, let's talk about the human body. Let's build these gymnasiums, and let's have the Greek philosophy, and that's very appealing for the Jews. A lot of Jews get swept away with that, and yet the Jews have competing, but no less substantive philosophical arguments." And it's essentially like a philosophical war that Hanukkah is really celebrating. It's a philosophical religious war, if you will. It's not necessarily about territory. The Jews were allowed to be in their territory, but they're told, let's study Torah. Torah is anathema to Greek ideology. Well, Greek ideology is anathema to our ideology. Well, what do you have? You have a conflict. Either way, after the story of Hanukkah, there is this brief period where the Jews have dominion and sovereignty over the land for about 100 years. That's what's known as the Hasmonean dynasty, where the Hasmonean family, they're going to be the monarchs in control of the land of Israel. That goes south pretty quickly, where you have the Hasmonean kings, they become Sadducees. And you have someone like Alexander Yanai becomes the king and the high prophet.
Now, is it true on the opposite spectrum where you didn't allow conversions during, we completely did away with the conversion during that one period? And when you get to the Hasmonean, is it
There was
true?
forced, right, exactly.
Yes.
There was forced proselytization, which is also against the Torah. Remember, when we have converts, we want to determine sincerity. If we force them to convert, we don't know sincerity. If it's so appealing that they convert because of all the goodies that come along with being Jewish, well, once again, we can't determine sincerity. But that's another example of how the Hasmoneans did things that were, against tradition. But think about this. You have a king who's also the high priest. That's an impossibility. To be a king, you have to be a descendant of King David. Davidic line, the Davidic monarchy. All legitimate kings of Israel are direct descendants of King David. And then and to be a prophet, you have to be from the Levi tribe, thus not a descendant of King David. And the Hasmoneans said, rules, So you have... and a lot of people are disturbed by that. They don't recognize him as being a king because he can't be a king. There's questions if he could be a high priest as well. But he also, he would openly mock a lot of the traditions. There's this great episode. I mentioned this in a previous talk here. There's a great episode on the holiday of Sukkot. Alexander Yanai, he's supposed to pour the water libations on the altar. Instead, he pours it on his feet, to mock the assembled multitudes, to mock their tradition. So they'll take their esros and start pelting him, and he almost died. Can you imagine? You have this tension between the nation, the people, and the leadership. And that obviously gets another wrinkle in the mix when you have the invitation to invite the Romans, the new fledgling empire, the Roman Empire. They're invited in to settle a dispute between two sons of the last queen of the Hasmoneans, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. They have a disagreement as to who's going to be the next Hasmonean king, and they invite Pompey into the land. And once the Romans come in, they don't leave. So from then on, they're going to essentially be in control over the land for hundreds of years, and they're going to appoint people to be kind of the puppets, representative leaders, and.
I found this on the web frequently also a lot of the portal water light of the
Is that for me? That was bizarre.
I am sorry. I don't know why that did that.
Wow.
I had my phone turned off.
No problem. No problem.
Sorry.
No big deal.
Yeah, it just like came out.
That was like a voice, a heavenly voice.
Messiah was
I just was trying to understand what it was talking about.
I guess I must have hit something with my foot.
No big deal. Either way, we meet a fellow by the name of Herod. Herod, we're not even sure if he's Jewish. There's questions as to whether or not he's Jewish, but he's the Roman guy in charge, and he starts murdering rabbis left, right, and center. But he also rebuilds the temple, refurbishes the temple, and, right? Builds these retaining walls that we still have today. The Western Wall is built by Herod. These fantastic cities he builds everywhere. Huh? Everywhere. All these Caesarea and all these just incredible stuff. But you have so... He built Masada, that's right. We have so many different factions in the land of Israel, so many competing entities, and all that, of course, culminates in the Great Revolt of the year 66. Obviously, we're going through this very quickly. There's a lot more details, but eventually culminating in the Romans. Methodically going through the land and destroying city after city and laying siege to the city. Whoever comes out is crucified. Once you capture a city, you burn everything. You take everyone prisoner. You salt the earth so nothing should grow there. Really, really, really bad. And we know, like we find in just a little anecdote we find in Josephus, that after the destruction of the temple, there were so many slaves that the slave market was flooded, that the price of a slave was cheaper than the price of a horse. So you have just a terrible tragedy, calamity. The temple is destroyed, the city is destroyed, and all the dreams of all these competing world views are destroyed as well. So the Sadducees disappear, the Essenes disappear, even the Judeo-Christians, they disappear, they become Christians. All you have left is the rabbis. And we know, we look at this as a transformation that's obviously tragic, but it kind of had to happen. Because there's no way that the Jewish people can exist with so much infighting. And we cannot have so much factionalism, sectarianism, amongst our people, because that's not what the Almighty wants of us. The Almighty wants of us to be unified as a nation. And when we are fighting each other, and when there's senseless hatred, baseless hatred, and when there's Jews killing Jews, God says, okay, I'll bring in the Romans. They're experts at killing Jews. Experts. And indeed, we look at it as a tragedy, but if you look at it in history, it was a purging almost, if you will, of all these other worldviews. They're all gone. We don't find any. The Sadducees were dominant. They were an enormous factor in the pre-destruction era. They were more dominant than the rabbis. More dominant than what we call the mainstream people. They had, they were the elites. They had all the money. They had all the influence. And the temple is destroyed. All their dreams are destroyed alongside it. People have to choose. You want to be a Roman, right? Or Greco-Roman, or you want to be a Jew. You can't be both. And that's I would say that's a theme throughout Jewish history. Either way, Jews are experts at rebuilding. You look at this in modern times, and what happened to the Jews in Europe, the greatest genocide in the history of humanity. And look at us today, how vibrant the Jews are in the United States, and ever more so in Israel. Where does this come from? Right? We are resilient. We get beat down, and we come back and rebuild ourselves.
You still have all these factions.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, but I would argue that the factionalism that exists today is a tenth of what it existed 100 years ago.
Do you think that's why Israel has such a coalition government? Do you think that feeds into?
It wouldn't exist without that government.
What do you mean?
I agree. I agree. We don't have that here
But Europe,
necessarily.
that's really more of a European model. I mean, they have the same.
You're talking about
thing
the
all through Europe.
parliamentary system?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but I think if you look at the parliamentary system, you find a lot of different kinds of Israelis, if you will, a lot of different kinds of Zionists. And Israel, I think, does a lot to unify all these what would be disparate groups. And I think that, yes, of course, there's disagreements. And if you go to the Knesset, you find some high-profile disagreement. Like, it's amazing what goes on over there. Because, being cordial and being dignified is not necessarily one of the requirements to be a member of the Knesset. There was a story a couple of years ago, amazing, you can find it on YouTube, where there's a Jewish Chaver Knesset and an Arab Knesset member. How can they agree on anything, right? Which is crazy. The Jews allow Arabs in the Knesset. Crazy. But either way, some of these are like terrorists. They're people that advocate killing innocent civilians. It's just unbelievable who's allowed if they're duly elected. It's incredible. Either way, so this Jewish Knesset member, she gets so frustrated with it. She takes his water and pours it on his head. Amazing. Can you imagine?
Well, you've seen other fights in different countries where the politicians throwing hands.
It's
Yeah, not only the Jews.
we have it in Canada with Mayor Ford. That's great.
Oh, well,
He was amazing.
Well, I don't know about this one with pouring the water. That's what she did.
She just poured the water on him.
over his head.
I can think of worse things to do.
Yeah, but you wouldn't
It's not
imagine
exactly dignified.
in
No,
the 2010s for that to happen. Either way.
But there was a big concern about Israel, being that the Arabs multiplied much quicker than the Jews, about the fact that there'd be more Arabs in Israel than there would be Jews, just on that basis. But it's 6 million compared to 2 million.
Yeah, well, it depends what you count. If you're counting Gaza, right, with the Israelis essentially said we're out of Gaza 10 years ago, right? But if you count Gaza, then that's true. Then you count Gaza. It depends who is actually counting Israeli citizens, PLO or Palestinian Authority controlled areas of the West Bank versus Israeli citizens in the West Bank. So it's unclear how you count them. But I think interestingly, a lot of Arabs would prefer living in Israel than living in Palestine. Because
The economy.
the economy, exactly. You take in an Arab country, but they don't have oil. What do they have? No, they have nothing, right? So they have labor. They're actually labor, but labor is only as good as the people willing to pay for the labor. If you don't have the wealthier people paying for labor, labor becomes very cheap. So if you're an Arab laborer, you would prefer to work in Israel and to get paid in Israeli money and make a very decent living.
There's also some fear, Fab. I'm sure if they didn't take a quote pro-Arab line in the Israeli Knesset or in Israeli public life, they might be threatened by, their families might be. So
of course.
Yeah,
Of course. So
they
there's some
enjoy
Israelis.
the fruits of where they are. They probably privately are very pro-Israel, but publicly they can't be.
That's right.
30,000 Palestinians a day come and try to get into Israel to go to work.
Yeah.
30,000.
At least I would say it's even more.
Yeah, but some of these people are probably downright. Some of their statements are probably considered downright treasonous against Israel.
Yeah, but
to their own.
that's right. But also, I think that for them, we have to understand their perspective. In Islamic law, if you sell what's called Islamic land to a non-Muslim, that's punishable by death. They're not playing games, right?
And that was just in the news here about a year ago, where Arab people did exactly that.
That,
And Jews had
that
gone
they
in and actually.
executed
No,
someone?
that Jews had actually gone in and purchased buildings.
Mhm.
And people didn't think that Jews owned them. They thought they were owned by Arabs, but the Arabs sold them.
Right, but if you're an Arab and you sell them, you might want to watch your back.
That's right. You better get out.
This thing with the water, I haven't seen that. I'm gonna
So
have to-
I give you guys an example here. I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, right? So for Shabbos, I was by my sister. She lives in the settlements. You know, what you call it settlements or occupied territories, right? It's only because of some green line that was concocted, 70 years ago. It doesn't really mean it's in Israel. You know, they're Israeli citizens that live under Israeli rule. But I noticed there's a lot of parks, a lot of public parks in the city that she lives in. So apparently, every little plot of land that's owned by an Arab, they make a park out of it. But some Arabs are not willing to sell it at no price. They're unwilling to sell their land, and therefore you have a Jewish community. Well, what happens if an Arab says, "Oh, I want to claim my land"? Well, if there's a building on that land, that's problematic. So they make it into public parks. That way, okay, take the park. What are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do with the park? Right? It's not, you don't have to destroy any houses or anything like that. But you actually have like these little pockets of, most of the land. A lot of land was bought in the 19th century. Lots and lots of land was bought by Arab landowners who weren't around, who were living in what was then Constantinople, right? What do they care about their land in Israel? And people want to pay top dollar, give it to them, right? So a lot of the land was actually purchased, but some of the land is still owned by Arabs to this day that are not willing to sell it, and Jews have to work around that. And well, maybe eminent domain. That would be a
They
solution.
have that in Israel?
Sure, they have some version of that.
What happens to the land, just the other day on my Facebook page, there was a terrorist, so Israel went in and destroyed the terrorist's home. What happens to the land that is owned by that terrorist?
Well, they just destroy the home, and they don't actually claim the land. It's a controversial policy, of course, but it has been proven
There's
to.
no search and, no seizure of property.
No seizure of
they
property.
just
They just destroy the property, and it's been proven to be an effective policy at mitigating the urge to blow yourself up. If you know that mom and dad and all your siblings are going to have to find a new place to live, and there's going to be $100,000, $200,000 in damages because the Israelis will send in bulldozers and they will destroy your apartment, maybe those 72 versions are maybe less appealing.
Half of them are boys anyway.
No, but when you're dealing with someone who's willing to give up their lives for a cause, there's very little you could do, right? So another thing they do, also controversial, even though it's the right approach, they take pig meat. They take pig meat and they put it on the body. They bury the body with pig meat. And apparently in Islamic law, if someone touches pig meat or is buried with pig meat, then they don't have entrance to paradise or whatever, their version of paradise.
They're more Jewish than the Jews.
And so if you know that you're not going to get your paradise anyhow, because you can see videos of it. They drop it like on the guy's face and on his body. Crazy stuff. But if you see that, it's going to lessen your interest in doing that. And I can see why that could be controversial. But if you're dealing with the people, that of course not all of them are crazy or crazies, but a lot of them are. I don't know, is it 5%, is it 10%, is it 20%, is it 50%? Most of them probably are not. They want to just live their lives peacefully. But some of them are, and that's the reality. What are you going to do? There's no way to weed them out. How are you going to weed them out? Some guy takes his kitchen knife and starts stabbing people. What are you going to do? How do you deal with such an enemy? It's not based upon motive or material motive. What are you going to do? You have to come up with these innovative, arguments for them to, obstacles for them to withhold from such behavior. Either way, Bibi is waiting for us to talk about him. We're going to get there. I should have to do this really, really, really quickly.
Well, in a way, we're there.
We are kind of there.
You know,
We have a story of Masada. We all know the story. That's kind of the last blow to Jewish sovereignty after the destruction of the temple. We meet Hadrian in the year 117, and he makes very oppressive laws, and the Jews revolt. In the Bar Kokhba revolt, they succeed in actually gaining sovereignty over the land for 3 years before the Romans come back with a fury and actually destroy everything and make Jerusalem Jew-free, and rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and rename Israel Philistinia, and rename all the cities in the land of Israel. And essentially Jewish life is no longer possible in Jerusalem.
This was who again?
This is the Romans, still
This
the
is the
Romans.
Romans still? Okay.
Romans. And the Jews that are still in Israel, most of them live in Babylon already. Jews that are in Israel move to the north. They move to the north. Israel, Tiberias, and that area becomes the center. But essentially, over the next couple hundred years, we're going to see that the Jewish community in Israel is going to weaken, while the Jewish community in Babylon is going to get very, very strong. Thus, we have the Mishnah was written in Israel in the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era. But the Talmud was written in Babylon several hundred years later. And essentially, there's going to be a transition from Israel being a place where we live to Israel being a place that we yearn for and hope to get there and to be center of our prayers and our thoughts. Right, so there is the first Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, is actually written in Tiberias at the year 320, give or take. And the Babylonian Talmud is written in Babylon at the year 500. But when we refer to Talmud, typically referring to the Babylonian Talmud, not the Jerusalem Talmud. Either way, from that point forward, we're going to find very scant life, Jewish life in Israel, while Israel is still the epicenter of our focus and our prayers. There's going to be several efforts to reestablish a Jewish community in the land of Israel. We know that the Ramban Nachmanides in the 13th century, he's going to move to Israel and he's going to establish some sort of small little life and community in Israel. We still have today his temple, his synagogue that he built. We have in the 16th century in Tzfat, the great Kabbalists in Tzfat, like the Arizal, Rabbi Joseph Cairo, very famously author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. He lives there. You have in the 17th and 18th century some Jews moving there. They go into Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. He's going to be someone who is going to start the pilgrimage to Israel and stop and turn around. One of the great questions is why he actually did that. But his descendants, his students are going to establish the Jewish community, the oldest Jewish community that we have today, called the Yerushalmi, Jerusalem faction of Jews that are there today. They've been there since the 18th century and the early 19th century. But you don't essentially have a mass migration of Jews till the middle and end of the 19th century. Modern day Zionism, of course, is not a new idea. We talked about how Israel has always been the focus of the Jews ever since the destruction. But the political Zionism really takes effect in the end of the 19th century. Of course, we talked about Herzl, someone who is not going to look like the prototype of a great Jewish leader. Assimilated Jew, couldn't read Hebrew. He proposed that the language of the nation should be German. He had a bar mitzvah himself, but didn't give his only son Hans a bar mitzvah. There's even a question as to whether or not his wife Julie was even Jewish. Either way, he is someone of great intelligence. He was a journalist from a very wealthy family. He had energy, boundless energy. And he, of course, we know the story. He was a correspondent for the Dreyfus trial in 1894. Essentially, a French-Jewish captain was accused with fabricated evidence of selling secrets to Germany, and everyone's parading him through town. Death to the Jews, death to the Jews. And Herzl is there, and he's like, I'm assimilated. I can't even read Hebrew. I don't observe anything. Why are they so angry at the Jews when the Jews are no different than them. And he concluded that the only solution to the Jewish problem of life in Europe was to have our own state.
Just have a what?
To have our own state.
Yeah.
So he writes the book, and he establishes the congresses, and he meets all the political leaders, and he really creates a political movement to establish a Jewish state, Zionism.
He had all the psychiatric problems in his family, right?
Well, his kids, some of them committed suicide. Yeah.
And he died early.
He died at the age of 44
Yeah.
in, I think, 1905. But it's interesting to see what happens with the idea. So it starts off as being a very secular idea, but it spreads like wildfire amongst the very religious, but more, I would say, primitive Jews. Well, I wouldn't call them primitive, but less sophisticated, so to speak, the Eastern European Jews, the traditional religious Jews. So you have these, essentially, these two movements, the religious Zionist movement, and then you have the secular Zionist movement, and those two together still to this day comprise Zionism in Israel. And the attitudes are very different because essentially it's based upon different groundwork. And you have someone like Herzl who is very skillful at navigating the tension that arises from having such different groups comprising the people of the movement. Right? They're able to make sure that everyone is included in this movement. By the way, another one who was great at that was Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion himself, he grew up religious, like most of the early state leaders. They grew up religious, but they abandoned religion for Zionism, which is the phenomenon that the religious opposition to Zionism was very wary of, where Zionism will be a replacement for religion. Religious Zionism is the idea of Zionism being a part of a bigger picture. Right? Israel is a central part of Jewish life and Jewish focus. But if it becomes a replacement, well, then it's very dangerous. To say, oh, we don't need the Torah because we're in Israel, we have Israel, we only needed it in Europe to distinguish ourselves from everyone else, that's a very dangerous attitude, but one that was very prevalent. And one that is manifest by some of the great Zionist leaders. But Ben-Gurion himself is someone who's able to navigate these two different groups, and he's able to accommodate the religious people and the secular people, make everyone happy that you don't have, God forbid, civil war in Israel. Because you have opposing views, really opposing views, that are unified under one flag. But either way, we find this great idea that really takes tremendous hold in Israel, with the people moving to Israel, the great idealists moving to Israel, someone like Golda Meir, who was born in Milwaukee, but essentially decides, I'm going to move to Israel, and becomes one of the great Zionist leaders, and of course, the prime minister, and her Hebrew was like, the really American, like accented Hebrew. But you have people from everywhere. The Zionist movement was tremendously powerful, young people, because it gave them something. It gave them hope. It gave them a future. It gave them a vision.
When did the community Meir Sharim?
So the Meir Sharim, that's from the students of the Gaon of Vilna. That's the oldest Yerushalmi. You have to meet people today that they're 8th generation Jerusalemites, been living there for forever, essentially.
And they don't recognize Israel.
Well, some of them don't. Some of them say, "What do you mean? We don't. They don't recognize the secular state, the secular Zionism."
Oh, I thought it had to do with the Messiah didn't come.
Well, and it means that they'll say, "Hey, the only way we can establish a state in Israel is a religious state." So secular Zionism is anathema to them. And by the way, interestingly, we had secular opposition to Zionism as well. Like the Reform movement was virulently anti-Zionism because their charter, at least the original charter, was had a quote as follows from the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. This is the official position of Reform Judaism at the turn of the century. Quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation but a religious community. Therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship on the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." That was written 12 years before the first Zionist Congress. Thus, when Zionism comes, that is viewed in opposition to what was then the position of Reform movement, which changed, by the way, in Columbus in 1937. This is from the Columbus platform. These were all written in English. Like, these were written in English. We could just give direct quotes from what Reform Judaism believed at that time. In the rehabilitation of Palestine, this is from the Columbus platform, 1937. The land hallowed by memories and hopes, we behold the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. In about 50 years, 52 years precisely, we see dramatic change in the position of Reform Judaism with regards to Zionism. In Houston, we have two major Reform synagogues, right? Emmanuel and Beth Israel, that they split over support of Israel. Because the old school Reform said, we're against the state of Israel. Right? The New Age Reform, they say, we're in favor of land Israel. They split into two different synagogues. Either way, so Zionism, essentially, there is going to be a religious Zionism, secular Zionism. There's going to be religious opposition to Zionism, like Bernie mentioned, and there's going to be secular opposition to Zionism. Or wherein there's people say, hey, who needs Israel? If we support Israel, then it shows that we're not so committed to our, to Germany or to France or to the United States or to wherever we live. But either way, as we know, there is going to be a founding of a state. And of course, it doesn't happen overnight. There's the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the Peel Commission of 1937, which is the first time where the British mandate, the British government essentially declared in their findings the idea of making a Jewish state alongside an Arab state. In November 29th, today, of 1947, we have the partition plan. The United Nations adopts a partition plan to take British Palestine and to divide it and have one half for the Jews in a Jewish state, one half for the Arabs in an Arab state. Unsurprisingly, the Arabs rejected the plan, while the Jews accepted it. Every single time there has been a plan and an agreement to allow the Jews to have a state in Israel, the Arabs have opposed it. 1937 Peel Commission, 1947 partition plan, even 2000 the Camp David Accords, where Ehud Barak, the prime minister at the time, offered Arafat. He offered him 97% of the West Bank plus Gaza and land swaps equivalent to those 3%. Land swaps equivalent in Israel proper. Granddaddy offer. And of course he said no. And we know that there was a resolution at the founding of the Palestinian Liberation Authority, or organization, in 1967. They came what's called the Khartoum Resolution. In it, on line number 3, it says as follows: 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. Those 3 no's essentially dominate Palestinian mindset. They're not going to have peace, they're not going to negotiate, they're not going to recognize the land of Israel. If we want to negotiate a settlement of hostilities with Palestinians, yet the founding charter declares no peace, no Israel, no negotiations, how do we even talk with them? Like, how can we have a dialogue? How can there be any political dialogue? Well, they just recently found out that in 2008, in Ehud Olmert, the prime minister at the time, he offered a similar offer, peace offering, to Mahmoud Abbas, and they rejected it. And you have, today, we have Gaza being controlled by Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. right, by the United Nations, by the United States. It's a terrorist organization. And they are in control of the Gaza Strip, and it's 2 million people. The Israelis left 2005, 2007. The Hamas, they took control, which, in my view, is actually one of the great political moves of all time. Why? What happens when a terrorist organization suddenly starts needing to collect taxes and build infrastructure and, right, pave the roads, right, establish hospitals and oversee education, commerce, and, right, law and order? What happens? It's harder to be an effective terrorist organization.
Right.
So Gaza is now, for the past 8 years, it's under the leadership of Hamas, and Hamas has to take political actions and be motivated by political as well as a terrorist interests, and therefore the terrorist interests get relegated to secondary importance. So I don't know if this was the intention, because it's a huge debate in Israel today as to whether or not it was smart for the Israelis to leave Gaza, because now it became a stronghold of Hamas. But incidentally, Hamas now has done less terrorist attacks because they've been more focused on keeping the peace amongst themselves. Interesting.
But Hamas also formed a unity government with Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah, of course. Of course, they're the same.
So now
They're no
when
different.
you negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas,
Yeah, like the moderates are not quite that moderate, clearly.
Handing over Gaza was a stroke of genius, in my opinion, for the simple reason that now the Egyptians have to control it.
Oh yeah, the Egyptians can't stand them.
The Palestinians are all over Egypt right now. There's infiltrating in. They've taken over the whole electronics industry, and they're running the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So now they know what it's like.
And the Egyptians hate the Palestinians more than the Israelis do.
Yeah,
So
I do.
which is almost hard to believe, but
yeah.
they've also found tons of terrorist tunnels that they have flooded with water.
So in 1948, on May 14th, the British officially end their mandate over Palestine. That same day, the Israelis made a strategic decision to unilaterally declare a state, right? Not wait for the United Nations to support it, not wait for anyone, just unilaterally declare a state. They declare a state. The United States is the first country to recognize Israel. Right? Harry Truman was a great friend of Israel, or at least with regards
I
to.
thought the Soviet Union was the first.
Oh, maybe. Well, either way, I may have to check the
No,
details.
I think the Soviet Union was I think it was close, but I think the Soviet, because at the time I think the Soviet Union thought that Israel might become a communist.
Well,
country.
because it was
Definitely a socialist.
Yes,
country.
definitely a socialist, and a lot of communes as well. The kibbutz is a commune, right? But either way, there is the next day, 5 Arab nations declare war on Israel. It was not certain at all that Israelis would prevail. Indeed, they did, and in 1949, beginning of 1949, there became a ceasefire, essentially, but not no peace terms were agreed upon, but there was a ceasefire, and the state began to develop, and it was, of course, very, very, very poor. There were rationings of food. They didn't have anything.
Soviet Union.
Thank you. So, and then how much longer was how much later?
By Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Ireland, South Africa. The United States extended recognition after the first Israeli election on January 31st, 1949.
Okay, so it wasn't immediate. Thank you. I stand corrected. Soviet Union was the first.
You were right.
But either way, Israel, Israel was established, and the fledgling state started functioning, and operating, and they were at a tremendous disadvantage. Why? Number one, because they're surrounded by a lot of enemies. Number two, because they have a land with scarce resources. Water. They had huge water problems. And they, of course, very creative, very innovative.
Stole the water.
Do whatever it takes, right? But constantly had to deal with the realities of what it means to actually run your own state. At the time, they didn't get any military aid from the United States. They weren't able to buy any military equipment from the United States. They had to use these back channels. They got French. The French were the big suppliers of Israeli warfare weaponry until they started developing their own, of course.
French helped them in 56 with
Yeah, so in 56 there was a big skirmish, the Suez Sinai problem.
the French were the ones the U.S. didn't do.
Yeah, of course.
Eisenhower didn't do anything.
Now in
He made them to, yeah, he made them withdraw.
Get out of there.
1967, it's been 19 years. The state kind of got some steady footing, but clearly war was imminent because the Egyptians, supplied by the Soviets, they built an enormous army. They had very incendiary rhetoric. Thank you again for those words today. Really appreciate it. For example, on May 27th, 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, said as follows. He said, "Our only goal is the destruction of driving them into the sea.
Of what?
Driving them into the sea."
The
And it's-
Zionist entity. What?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we know one of the most dramatic wars in all of military history, the 6-Day War, where Israel, in 6 days, managed to disable the entire army of the Egyptians, right? When they made the sneak attack on June 5th, 1967. They destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of planes, most of them on the ground. Then they destroyed the air. Then they destroyed. Well, first they destroyed the runways, then destroyed the planes, and then they were free to go. And simultaneously, they destroyed tens of airfields in Egypt. And within the first few minutes of the war, Israel had air superiority. Then they went and destroyed the same thing in Syria. And then after a couple of days, Jordan Jordan joined because they believed the rhetoric that was coming from Nasser that Tel Aviv is burning and Haifa is burning and everything like that, And then so they joined, and then the Israelis trounced them as well. And on day 3, they captured the old city, Jerusalem. And after 6 days, the stunning turnaround, where everyone was sure that disaster was near and the Israelis are going to be destroyed. All the foreigners left. They dug 10,000 graves in public parks. Crazy. Everyone was just short, just accommodating all the dead. And overnight, Israel's borders are 5 times the size. They capture all of Sinai, capture the Golan, they capture the old city, the West Bank, everything. They're suddenly under Israeli control. Things are wonderful. What happens when things are wonderful? You get too pompous. What happens when you get too pompous? You're vulnerable. And a mere 6 years later, the terrible war, the Yom Kippur War, Israel is caught with their pants down, so to speak. A terrible disaster. Even though in the end it kind of ends in this kind of ceasefire, so to speak, just kind of the stalemate. They didn't have necessarily territorial losses, and but still it was a disaster. Many Israelis and Jews died. And I would argue that contributed to 1977, the first quote-unquote right-wing government, when Menachem Begin is elected to become prime minister. Of course, in 1979, there's peace with Egypt, peace that has prevailed despite their flirtations with radicalism recently.
And
Sadat, that's right, and unfortunately he gets shot as a result, but he's, they both are awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's been beneficial for everyone involved.
He shot on October the 6th, I think.
Thank you. In 1994, Israel has peace with Jordan, right? King Hussein, of course. And in 1996, there is an increase in terrorism in the land of Israel. And the young upstart, right, Netanyahu, who is at the head of the Likud party. He is going up against Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres, everyone thought was going to win. There's an increase in terror, and of course, that contributes to the more hawkish leader getting elected. Netanyahu was the first prime minister to be born in the state of Israel. He was really young, really dynamic, very charismatic, very polished and articulate. He becomes prime minister, and his leadership lasts till 1999, when Barak and then Sharon, and of course Barak decides to unilaterally withdraw from Lebanon. Sharon decides to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. In 2009, Netanyahu is elected once more, and he's still the prime minister. But if you look at Israel today, like I said, it goes from 600,000 Jews in 1948 to 6 million Jews in 2015. It goes from being a nation that is low on resources, surrounded by enemies, right? Has to scrape and scrap its way through in its military engagements, when now it has one of the most sophisticated and capable armies in the world. It is a bastion of research and development. In fact, it's the highest. It has the highest percentage of GDP dedicated towards research and development than any other country in the world, at 6.2%, I believe, which is enormous amount dedicated towards that. And every phone that you have, every single phone has components that were developed and manufactured. I don't know if they're manufactured, but at least developed in Israel. Their water problems, they figured out a way to come with that creative solutions to all these common problems.
Now they're helping California solve their water.
Yeah, exactly. They say, hey, let's desalinate. We have the Mediterranean. It's full of water, plenty of water, but it's full of salt. Well, let's just take out the salt. Well, how do you do that? I don't know. Figure it out.
Yeah, and then Avis, did you see where Avis refused
Yes,
the
I
vice
saw that.
president of Teva?
Oh, he refused him a rental car, yeah. But either way, and I also like to look at it from, let's say, a kind of a macro picture. We look at Israel, where essentially it's a unified nation, even though there's so many different kinds of Jews living there. You have the immigrants, you have the locals, you have the religious, you have the non-religious, you have the settlers, you have the people that live in the settlement, and the people in Israel, and they're all together, and they're all mostly unified, and there's no civil war, there's no threat of civil war, and I think it's a wonderful thing. I think that that's progressing more and more, and I think that if we were to look at kind of the religious perspective of establishing a state in Israel, and that kind of fulfilling the prophecies of bringing the Jews back to Israel, no one would make the argument that on day one, Israel was the way it's intended, the way it's forecasted to be in the prophecies. No one's going to say that, oh, this is we have arrived. But over time, where we see that there is more of a focus on traditional Jewish values, not just a secular state. And the idea of secular Zionism is almost dead. Zionism today, is most of the secular, not most, a significant portion of the secular Zionists, right? They live what's called there's the American dream and there's the Israeli dream. What's the Israeli dream? To live in Israel and go to the army and then move to America. That's what someone made that joke. That's the Israeli dream. Because we have hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Jews living in America, selling you, skin products, right? And what happened to the secular dream of building a state? What happened to that? That died.
The economy.
The economy's good. It's maybe not as good, but it's very good. And the people that came, they were committed to ideals. They didn't care about the economy.
But I mean, those are coming to the States. I mean, it's a tough life.
It's a tough life, but they embraced it. Initially, they embraced it. I'll make the argument that the secular Zionism died in the Yom Kippur War, where suddenly what happened? It was such a disaster. But still, we see a convergence of Jews in Israel. And I think it's getting closer and closer to the ideal that indeed is what's prophesied in the Torah. Jews will come back to God. and come back to Israel. I think we're well on our way. I encourage everyone to go visit every once in a while, support Israel in any way that we can. But not only that, like we have to ask ourselves the question: what are we doing here? Well, what are we doing? Well, what are we doing? What are we doing over here? Why are we in Houston, Texas?
Because we're supporting Israel.
Okay, so but it means it's a good question. I'm not asking. I'm not asking the question to elicit an answer. I'm just saying that has to be our attitude. We have
We need to go there and help them develop their gas,
their gas. What is that?
because they have found huge gas
Yeah.
reserves.
The Leviathan. That's right.
We're, I
That's
mean,
what
but-
Texans can do.
we're Americans.
We have that spot in Desdemona.
You know, I guess, are you trying to say, what are we more Jews or?
Well,
or
that's the
Americans?
question we have to ask ourselves. But even we can be Americans, but we, as Jews, you know, that we're kind of, we really ought to be in Israel, you know, and why, you know, it is to be unthinkable, like, you know, where finally we can fulfill our dreams of going back to Israel, and Jews say, well, we're Americans, you know. So yeah, I'm not trying to elicit an answer. I'm just saying that you know, that's the question we have to ask.
Something to think about. I mean,
Either way, guys, thanks for outlasting. We got to Bibi. I apologize for going over time. Thanks once again for spending some of your.
2,000 years for Bibi, right?
What won't we do?
this is a whole nother subject along the same line, but I've always wondered, and I have some knowledge of it, I guess all of us do, but I've always wondered, why is the propaganda so successful that Jerusalem is a Muslim property or whatever?
Yeah.
I know about the Dome of the Rock and all that, but all it's even more than the preponderance of evidence is that it was given to the Jews.
It's an uphill battle. It's
Yeah,
an uphill
but how
battle,
have they been-
and
yeah, that's-
and one thing that we're not good at is propaganda.
Isn't Jerusalem, I mean, is it even mentioned in the Koran?
It's not mentioned once in the Quran. It's mentioned 750 times in the Torah, in the Bible,
So,
Jewish Bible.
It's amazing
I want to
how
know why all the
so much of the world,
sites are non-Muslim by the UN.
Yes, so it's an uphill battle, but you know, slow and steady, right?